The attic smelled like wet cardboard and old pencils when I pulled the twine from the first banker's box. Shoulder season thaw had climbed the town and crept under the shingles. Meltwater tapped a rhythm down the downspout outside the gable, a slow metronome counting off a late afternoon that didn't care what I needed from it. My mother labeled all her boxes the same way: black marker, neat block letters, quadrant dates tucked in parentheses like she was keeping watch over an era that might sneak out the side door. I carried the box to the folding table I had set between the rafters and the smoke-stained insulation, then set the dry bag open at my feet in case the roof decided to remember a leak it used to have. I worked as I'd been taught: open, orient, record, rehouse. Each map came out with a photograph on the phone, front and back, edge to edge with a ruler for scale. The hand-drawn quads were on the toothy vellum she favored, the kind that takes a hard pencil line without smudging. A small brass compass, its lid brassed thin at the hinge, rode the top of the stack like a coin on a magician's knuckle. I set it aside, turned the first sheet, and caught my breath. She had drafted a trail I'd never seen on any USGS. Thin graphite climbing a south-facing shoulder, behind the little timber town where I grew up. Switchbacks stacked tight as ribs, a creek name I knew and a spring I didn't. The pencil slope grades were coded in her own shorthand, slashes and dots I could still read. I traced the route in the air with a finger and felt the old ache of getting pulled into whatever puzzle had made her pick up a pencil in the first place. Routine steadied me. I laid the altimeter watch on the table and let it settle, then set its pressure to the hour's station, reading off the NOAA text. Elevation in this attic should have been 1,042 meters by benchmark record from the courthouse foundation 2 blocks down. The watch wavered between 1:48 and 1:50, bobbing 2 meters at a time like the attic had a tide. I chalked it up to the storm remnant slowly sighing out of the valley and wrote the values with the time beside the photograph number in my notebook. I adjusted declination on the base plate compass to the current 15.1 degrees east for our part of the Cascades and clicked the bezel until the dogged little triangle lined up like a shouldered responsibility. The brass pocket compass from her stack I left untouched. It had always had her hand heat in it, and even now I couldn't decide whether opening it was method or grief. At first, the margin notes kept me busy. A tight cursive, lean forward like a hiker crossing a late patch of snow, and everywhere the voice I could hear if I let myself. Coordinates sat along the borders where she would geo-reference by eye before she had access to all the digital tools. Little reminders to check rock type at a bend, or to ask Walt, logging road decommission 1979, spur B. A few dates from 30 years ago. Then a date from 6 springs back, drawn a hair darker, and the word return. The pencil line from that year stepped the switchbacks higher than any of the old sets, reached a saddle she had never labeled before, and then stopped in a fur stand drawn loosely with quick strokes. No continuation, no cross-country line, not even a question mark like she sometimes allowed herself when field and paper briefly shook hands and disagreed. I cleared space on the table and spread 2 printed USGS 7.5-minute quads of the same terrain, the newer revision and the one from my teenage summers. The current map carried the fresh scars of fire lines cut 3 summers ago. When I overlaid her vellum on the older quad, the creek beds and ridge names snapped into place, as if they had always been waiting for one another. When I slid the vellum onto the newer print, the fit was good until it wasn't. The northern grid pinned at 2 points exactly, and then drifted a thumb width off at the third, a small, insolent error that couldn't be shrugged off by paper stretch. I measured, not guessing. From the school bus turnaround to the confluence, fine. From the confluence to the saddle, fine. From the saddle to the section corner in the timber, wrong by 42 meters to the east. I checked the attic air, the angle of the lamp, the way the vellum curled as a draft found it. Something had nudged the world sideways in a way pencils didn't usually go. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was a spur line miscopied, or the way she drew, flick of the wrist out of habit. But habit was the point of her method, and she had drilled that into me. Get your reference, pick 3 points, triangulate, and never treat the paper like it knows more than the place. I found myself checking the altimeter again, even though I knew it wouldn't help with lateral drift. It held at 1:49 now, a meter higher than 5 minutes ago, while the wind outside had gone briefly silent, as if listening back. What I had in the attic were the ingredients for a clean first look. The shoulder season window was that careful, annoying week, when the lower roads firmed up by day and iced by night, when the higher spurs were still snowed in, when water decided to be water only during the hours you needed to cross it. My plan was to start at the paved turnout, where the forest line pressed the shoulder, calibrate the altimeter watch at the bridge plaque, walk in and out on the old service track above the creek without committing to anything the thaw might punish. The hand-drawn quads would ride in the dry bag with a foam board behind them. The trail cams could take a look without me if the bench delivered even a sliver of sight down to the switchback run. I would move like a cartographer first and a child second. I lifted the brass compass without meaning to. The lid clicked in a way I recognized, the sound of a thing getting ready to work. The needle drifted to north and then slid a fraction past, as if the attic had learned a new trick while no one was around to tell it not to. I rotated the case slowly, knowing how they sometimes stick if they've got a burr on the pivot, but the swing was smooth and the pulls was always a degree or two east of where the base plate compass insisted the world began. I set the brass one down on the older USGS print and watched the needle split the R in river. I set the base plate's orienting lines to the printed grid and saw the dogged red arrow point somewhere else by an irritable hair. It felt like a petty argument between quiet instruments, until I realized that my mother had penciled a tiny plus 1.2 dig in the corner of the vellum dated 6 springs ago. She had noted an offset she didn't trust enough to anchor the work with. She had made a mark to talk to her later self. I shut my eyes and listened for the sound the house makes when it's thinking. Meltwater again down the spout. A car 2 streets over. The wind testing the firs that bracketed the alley. Under it, a quieter tap-tap. Irregular. Not this roof, not plumbing. It took me a second to locate it. Something under the table, a patient drop from the belly of the dry bag where I'd set a damp rag after wiping a dusty box lid. A single bead of water fell out at the seam and hit a packing slip stuck to the floorboard. I moved the bag and saw the ring it left on the board, a dark oval not even the size of a lens cap, plus a second faint ring slightly offset to the east. The house was not level. Everyone knew it, but I also knew how the slight slant carried liquid. The bead walked east when gravity here said it should creep along the joist line to the south. Maybe the board crowned in the other direction. Maybe I wanted a problem more than I had one. I reached down and laid the base plate edge along the seam, set the tiny level bubble, and stared at the glass until the bubble told me the line I trusted was true, and the water didn't care anyway. It felt like talking to her to say aloud what I would do. I would leave before first light so I could catch the creek at its overnight low, let the day warm behind me and not ahead. I would take the trail cams and a single card for each, brand new, no old ghosts on them. The altimeter watch would get one more calibration at the highway pass sign, and I'd write the pressure readings in the notebook next to the bridge plaque numbers. I'd follow the bench where I could, keep snowshoes in the truck but hope not to need them, stay off the old switchbacks until I knew how the thaw was undercutting them, and leave a note with the neighbor in case the weather decided I'd been arrogant. The brass compass I still didn't want to pocket. I slipped it into the dry bag anyway, wrapped in a bandana the color of something I'd once wanted to be braver about. When I carried the boxes back against the knee wall, a thin page drifted down from the lip of the first box and slid under my boot. It was one of her field slips, torn from a pocket notebook, the kind she would number and staple into a day's bundle for the archive. The handwriting was hers, the timestamp late in an afternoon, the letters a little dark like the pencil had been newly sharpened. She had written 3 lines only. Bridge plaque off by 0.3 m. Spring smell on north aspect, return alone. I kept my boot on the slip for a second longer than necessary, while the attic took another breath and gave it back. Then I bent, lifted the note, and knew my first stop wasn't the turnout after all. It was the plaque, and the north aspect where spring shouldn't have been telling the truth in thaw. I loaded the dry bag with the quads, slid the trail cams into the side sleeve, checked the batteries by habit and by touch. The compass bezels kept their arguments to themselves as I shut off the lamp and eased the attic hatch down. The evening breathed up the stairwell and carried the smell of wet fir needles and a faint mineral sweetness that did not belong to town. I paused halfway down, not because of the smell, but because the house felt one notch taller than it had a minute ago, the air slightly thinner, the altimeter on my wrist clicking quietly, as if counting steps I had not taken. I looked at the digits glowing in the dim and memorized the number without writing it down, the way you do when you want to know if the world will give you back what you gave it. I left before sunrise, the truck heater struggling against the cold that clung to the river bottoms. Shoulder season is a hinge the Cascades love to creak on. The defroster cleared an oval at the exact speed the sky flipped from graphite to lead. I drove with the hand-drawn quads flat under a clipboard on the passenger seat, altimeter watch on my wrist ticking its small corrections. At the pass sign, I pulled onto the gravel apron, stepped out, and let the watch breathe. Pressure from the morning WX, 1017.6 HPA. Adjusted altitude here should read 1,028 meters. The display swung from 129 to 131, then settled at 130 like a tired horse finding its stance. Not perfect, but honest enough for a day that would change its mind 3 times before lunch. At the bridge, the old green girder over the creek, I parked off the shoulder and walked to the center plaque. The bronze had been polished unintentionally by hikers' jackets and intentionally by some kid with steel wool. My mother's slip said, off by 0.3 m. I set the steel tape against the curb, anchored the hook, and laid the 0 at the east pilaster's inside face. I took the reading to the center of the plaque's 191 and did the same from the west. A jogger passed and didn't lift her eyes from whatever rhythm she kept. The measurements disagreed with the stamped numbers by 32 centimeters and 31, depending on which side I favored for the curb's chipped edge. I checked 3 times, changed my stance, reset the tape. The mismatch would have been nothing in a field day with rotten stakes and soft ground, but this was cast metal and held to the bridge by bolts wider than my ring finger. Something in the deck had moved enough to lie to the plaque, or the plaque had been set to a truth that the creek took back. I wrote the numbers in my notebook, date, time, air temp, the hum from the girders in a new column I didn't usually keep. When I set the baseplate compass on the plaque to draw a quick sketch, the needle clasped north obediently. The brass pocket compass from the attic floated a degree east of that, the same small insistence as yesterday. I rotated the brass lid until the hinge lay along the girder and watched the needle think. It steadied, then twitched, a tiny shrug you'd miss if you weren't arguing with instruments for a living. I marked the offset in pencil on the back of my mother's vellum, along her same margin, and felt slightly superstitious for writing beside her hand. The creek was low, running clear over cobbles the color of old coins. I leaned on the rail and tasted the air. South-facing banks gave off wet cedar and the stale mineral of thawed duff. The north aspect was shadowed, a face that should have kept its winter secret longer. From there came a faint sweetness, not spring flowers. It was too early for the trillium to do anything but coil, but something aquifer cool and green, like water coming out from under a log pile. I wrote, spring smell on north, and underlined it once, same as the slip. It felt like she'd been standing in my exact place, left side to the rail, pencil tucked behind her ear. Return alone, she had written. I was alone enough for the kind of listening I needed. Upstream, a decommissioned service track cut a narrow bench above the creek. I hiked it, careful where freeze and thaw had slumped the outer edge. Snow lingered in strips on the mossy side, pocked and refrozen, the color of old typing paper. The hand-drawn trail climbed from a notch near the third switchback the bench could see. That notch didn't show on either USGS quad, but on her vellum it was there, a tight S-turn you'd only put in if you'd felt it in your ankles. I set the first trail cam at the bench's slight crown, where it could look down across the creek to the slope with the supposed spring. The routine helps when the doubt shows up. I logged, cam A, bench crown, 0732, UTM, 10T, 06148294961302, plus 6M, azimuth, 026 dig, baseplate, 028 dig, brass, height above ground, 1.7 mode, photo plus short vid, interval 30 seconds, trigger, high sensitivity, notes, frost on backplate, lens clear, card, brand new, battery 96%. I let the watch settle again. Altitude read 1,074 meters, which matched the map within a meter, the kind of agreement that makes you suspicious after a morning of petty arguments. A dog barked twice from down valley, distant enough to sound like a broom tapping a porch. The creek's voice stitched through the trees, louder where it slipped into a rock throat, softer under the ice shelf scallops. The second cam I carried further, past the rotten culvert, where the bench narrowed to a boot width. On the far side, an animal track stitched downhill, 2 hooves, small, the splay of a black-tailed deer. Beside the final set, half a boot print with a lug pattern I didn't recognize in that shoe size. It faced upslope, then stopped among the sword ferns as if the owner had changed their mind in mid-ankle. I lifted the fern and found no continuation. Maybe it was a misprint from someone scraping mud against a stump. Maybe it was old, softened by thaw, and then held in the morning cold. I looked for the usual trash, candy wrapper, twist of flagging, but the ground kept its own counsel. Breadcrumb 1, half-track without a partner, upslope toward the hand-drawn switchbacks. I set cam B to watch the notch, backstopped it with a wedge, and stepped away until the PIR blink told me it could see me leave. On the way back along the bench, I tested the smell again. At one point the air went colder for 3 paces, then warmed to match the hillside. A pocket of different weather, too small to belong to the general day. I stopped in the center of it and closed my eyes. The spring smell was stronger here, clean like crushed new licorice fern and stone dust. But there was also a faint metallic tang of something rubbed, like wet iron. Breadcrumb 2. I knelt and cleared needles from the soil and found a dark seam spearing under the duff. A wet line only a few inches wide. I pressed a finger to it and then to my lip. The water was cold, as true spring water is cold, and I wanted to believe it was just that, not thaw from a snow patch hiding upslope in the firs. I took a temperature with the cheap IR thermometer clipped to my pack strap, aiming at the seam, then at the duff 10 centimeters away. Seam, 6.3 digs, ambient soil, 2.9 digs. The difference shouldn't have been so neat in a patchwork thaw, not with this aspect still carrying winter's shade. I wrote the numbers down with times and watched my breath rib the sun shaft like a pencil cross-hatching. I could see 3 of my mother's penciled switchbacks from a certain angle, if I was willing to pretend the ferns were contour lines. The slope above the notch wore the kind of old logging ghosts a map doesn't argue with. Blunted stumps, a cat road falling off into brush. The hazard wasn't the slope, it was the thaw under it. I don't step on a line until the snowpack says you can. But you can stand across the creek and watch an idea from the safe side. I raised binoculars and glassed the timber where the vellum drew a loose green cloud. Something was different in the spacing, not enough to be a human hand, maybe just wind throw healed over, maybe the spring's feed path scribbling its own geometry. Twice I thought I saw a quick blink of light where no light should reach this hour. When I lowered the glasses, the glints were gone, the canopy back to wet dark. I took a bearing to the glints with the base plate and noted 0.24D Gs, then checked with the brass. It settled at 2060 G again, stubborn as any old tool that had outlived the instructions for it. I sketched both lines onto the margin of the printed quad and let the discrepancy sit. Spatial drift can hide inside small numbers until your feet have to pay. I set a third cam low in the understory to watch the seam's immediate area and tied a flag of dull brown tape knee-high a dozen meters away, not to mark it for anyone else, just so I could relocate the exact place if the snow squalls forecast for afternoon took a swing at the bench. The moral question showed up at the car. Do I step onto her trail today or earn it with 2 passes from safe ground? My mother's note had 3 words for me, and they were not a dare. They were a caution. Return alone. Alone meant no partner. It also meant no bystanders if I made a poor choice. The weather was holding by the sound of the wind in the treetops. Just a steady brush, no freight tone yet. I ate a bar I didn't want and scribbled a route decision as if writing could make the day less complicated. Stay benchside, observe, do not cross the creek, do not get seduced by a dry-looking slope, harvest cameras before storm window, exit by 12:30. I walked up valley 1 more kilometer to a bend where the creek ran against a shale wall. The acoustics there play tricks with your ear. Sound doubles back and stacks on itself. I clapped once and timed the return on the watch, 1.3 seconds. Then I turned toward the notch and clapped again. The echo came back wrong, late, like it had gone out and wandered before deciding to answer. I tried 3 more times and got 2 honest returns and 1 more that dragged. Breadcrumb 3, delayed echo toward the penciled switchbacks. The creek's normal hiss drowns tests like that if you're sloppy. This felt clean. I took a photo of the bend and the angle to the notch, so I could sit with it later, without the day's breath in my ear. By the time clouds shouldered the ridge, I'd sketched a pattern I trusted enough to leave behind. Cam A, Cam B, Cam C were doing the listening I couldn't keep up. I backtracked to the truck, writing down the small details that make a map more than a picture. A snag with a lightning scar at km.8, a windfall that had fallen in the neatest way a sawyer could have asked for, a culvert whistle, at a frequency the ear registers as almost speech when the gust hits right. At the truck, I checked the altimeter again and caught the digits climbing 1 meter, then 2, while the sky above me didn't change density at all. The watch stopped at 1,083 meters, 3 above what the bridge's deck and the topo insisted. I put the truck key in the ignition and left it there while I stood very still and listened to the creeks say what creeks say when nobody believes them. I told myself I'd come back this afternoon, not to step on the switchbacks, but to harvest the cards before the storm scooped them up or froze their reports. The brass compass rode in my pocket, warm wherever my body warmed it. As I turned toward town, a glint winked once from the shadowed side, the same place the binocular note would mark on the drive home. A single flash, small as a coin held to sun, then nothing but dark timber and the sense of a draft moving sideways where the day had no reason to let it. By noon, the ridge wore a clean gray lid, and the wind had the dry clatter of alder catkins. I left town with a thermos and the uneasy sense that I'd written too confident a plan in the morning. The bench track was narrower under a sky that looked heavier than its weight, and the creek spoke up enough to drown the small sounds you count on. I went to the bridge first to take a quick second reading before the weather shifted pressure. The altimeter watch, recalibrated at the pass again, read 130 there and held steady for a full minute. I scratched the number under the morning's entry and watched the water as if it could return the difference I'd been making with myself all day. The cams were where I had left them. Cam A blinked its red ready light like a child pretending to sleep. Cam B had a thin halo of frost on its strap. Cam C wore a skin of mist so fine I wiped the lens with my breath and a microfiber cloth. I pulled the cards one by one, slipped each into its own sleeve, and carried them down valley until the creek's noise thinned enough that I could hear the little click when I seated the viewer's latch. I don't like to review in place. You miss things when the place tries to tell you what the images should be. Cam A had earned its keep. 3 deer at ode 11 on the bench crown, white throats bright in the dull light. A pair of gray jays doing what gray jays do, arriving in a frame as if they owned the notion of food. A splash of wind in the huckleberries that looks like an animal until it doesn't. At 10:02, a smear near the top edge like a hand brushed the lens, but a second image cleaned it, just a fern frond flipping into frame on the gust. Cam B, watching the notch across the creek, showed the slope being itself. Fir shadows breathing, a swollen twig breaking from ice with a tiny burst of crystals. Then at 09:47, 3 frames in succession caught a coin of light where none should be. Not bloom, not lens flare. The glint sat where the canopy was thickest, hung for 2 seconds as if someone had lifted a mirror to the sky, then was gone. The viewer stamped each with GPS-less time and the camera's sense of the day. The timestamps ran in perfect 30-second steps. Only at 09:47 did the next frame mark 09:48:12 instead of 17. A jump by 5 seconds in a series the camera is usually religious about. I wrote, by 09:47 glint plus 5s drift at glint and underlined it twice. Cam C, down by the seam, carried a stranger handful. One clip of the understory empty at 08:19, another empty at 50, then one at 19:21, where the fern tips at the edge of frame bent all at once as if pressed by a palm. Not wind's ripple, but a uniform lean and hold, release. No body in frame, no squirrel, no jay, no shadow giving itself away. I closed the viewer and let the bench be itself for a minute. The air had that thin brightness before snow that isn't brightness at all. It's a thinning of contrast where the world looks like a photocopy. I could see the line my mother had drawn as if she'd pulled it over the slope and left it there. It climbed from a place that doesn't know the word trailhead. No signboard, no black plastic post with a handful of stickers, no battered cedar plank. A trail starts where the ground agrees to be stepped on many times, even after someone swears it doesn't. The crossing point, if I was gonna make one, would be the shale bend. Rock lip, clean run, a place a person can be wrong and still live with it. I stayed on the bench. I walked it upstream beyond Cam B until the cut widened into a little lay-by of level ground with old tire bites fossilized in the dirt. 50 years ago or 5, some truck had felt right enough about this spot to turn around here. A wind-thrown fir had been cut once and fell again. The moss had eaten the cut end, so the saw teeth were only a rumor now. Along the back edge, parallel to the creek, a waist-high crib of rocks held a bank that would have wanted to slough. Not random. Hands had fitted those rocks. I knelt and pressed my fingers to the interior face and felt the chink stones give a little under my nail. Whoever built it had built it to last longer than a season. I swept the beam of the baseplate compass along the bench line and let the dogged red arrow settle. 8 degrees to the crib face. The brass compass gave me 90 degrees, a clean cardinal that felt like a dare. I walked the length of the bench in small steps, counting, noting the small dips where old drainage had been cut and abandoned. At the up valley end, the bench met a bank that had been shaved into a slope back when men and machines solved problems by changing the world's angle. At knee height, staggered, 2 old post holes, rotten wood ghosts still rimmed with duff, sat where a gate might have been if someone had ever cared to tell anybody to stop. I pressed the tip of a pencil into the soft center of one hole and felt only a mild give. No hidden modern sleeve, no steel. A trailhead with no sign then. A memory of an opening. On the ground 10 paces beyond, a scatter of gravel no road contractor would choose. Rounded creek pebbles mixed with crushed shale and 2 red stones that didn't match anything else on the bench. I lifted one and turned it in my gloved palm. Hematite, likely, dense and dull, with a whisper of polish like it had lived in pockets. Or like it had been carried here to hold down a map. I put it back exactly where it had lain, wrote 2 red pebbles, unlike bench lithology, and felt a small, absurd relief at having returned the stone to the day it belonged to. The smell pocket was where I expected it, a little downdraft of cool air that brought the springs green to my teeth and the wet iron note to my tongue. At that exact spot, the altimeter watch climbed 2 meters in 5 seconds, then sank 1, then held. I stood still as a stub and let it do what it wanted. The pressure reading trended lower like the storm had laid a meter of paper on the sky and then lifted it again just above my head. When I stepped 1 pace to the west, the digits returned to their previous number. When I stepped back into the spot, they rose again. I tried not to match that change to something I could see. Breadcrumb 1 for the afternoon, localized altitude gain under steady weather. The sound test at the shale wall repeated the morning's trick. 1. 3 seconds honest return to the crib. 1.3 again to the south aspect's open timber. 1.5 to the notch and a smear on the waveform like the echo had rubbed on something on the way home. I don't carry instrumentation for an echo beyond a watch and a sense of what delays mean. It could be the geometry of the notch. It could be snow pillows on the far side smearing sound. But the pattern ate at the part of my brain that likes patterns. Breadcrumb 2. Delayed echo persistent toward the penciled switchbacks. Crossing, the creek was still low enough to tempt. I walked down to the edge where the bank cut clean and studied the stones. A set of boot prints pincered the gravel bar. One set, small, the lug unfamiliar again, turned toe up to the slope, and then letting the creek take the story. I lay on my belly and checked the edges of the prints with the lens I use for lichens. The silt had a shallow shell where frost lifts detail and lays it back wrong. Age, a day, 2, thaw, lies like a witness who wants to be helpful. Breadcrumb 3. Partial boots at the legal side of a crossing, story breaks mid-letter. I didn't cross. Rules are not true because they're written. They're true because they keep you alive enough to write them again. Alone meant the choice was mine, and the cost was mine if the slab under the switchbacks had thawed weird. I backed out to the lay-by and sat on the bumper, with the map on the clipboard, and my mother's vellum over it. I traced the first 2 switchbacks with the pencil tip, and noticed something I'd missed. A faint penciled X at the base of the bench's shaved bank, right where the post holes lived. In her hand, pressed harder than the rest, a small note, mile 0.0 old. Old what? Old from whom? Some maps carry the language of people who made lines with shovels. Mile 0. 0 is a way of telling crews where to start counting. From the glove box I took the cheap handheld radio I use only when there are others to talk to. I keyed it on weather just to hear a voice that wasn't mine or the creek's. The automated voice rattled off the afternoon forecast. Snow at 1 meters by late day, gusts 20 to 30. The ridge above me would make its own decisions. I checked the trail cam's remaining battery, as if it mattered. 94% dual for A, 92% for B, 95% for C. Good for a night if I decided to leave them. I scrawled a tight note to myself that I could read in the dark. If storm hits, harvest now or commit to mourning. Do not hike switchbacks until soil freeze returns. I needed a place to think without the bench's little arguments. Driving back toward the bridge, the glint returned. One flash, same patch of dark timber, like a match struck inside burlap. I pulled into the bridge turnout and let the truck idle. The bronze plaque, honest liar, looked the same. I put the base plate compass down on it for no reason except to watch an obedient instrument be obedient, north. I put the brass compass beside it and watched the needle choose its small heresy. A gust nudged my shoulder. The brass needle faltered, swung further east for one beat of the heart, then came back and trembled. I turned the lid so the hinge pointed at the notch, as if asking a question, in the only grammar the little tool knew. The needle didn't point to the notch, not exactly. It pointed 2 degrees east of it, to a place on the slope where her vellum had no line at all. I stayed like that too long, elbows on cold metal, counting the seconds between gusts and the seconds between something like the glint and nothing like it. Finally, out of stubbornness or respect, I wrote one last entry. Trailhead has no sign but knows it's a start. Yet I sealed the cards into the dry bag, packed the viewer, and told the cams to keep watching while the weather went about its work. On the drive out, the altimeter climbed again by a meter as I rolled downhill, a reversal that should never happen in a tool that takes its orders from pressure alone. The watch clicked back to the correct number just as the first fine snow started to sow the air. Back at the attic door that evening, I laid the vellum under the attic lamp and traced my pencil along her mile 0.0. I let the line hover over the place where the brass compass had wanted me to look, and stopped my hand there. On the floor, the dry bag set down a faint oval of damp again, and a second oval half an inch east of it, though the floor bubble still held true. Snow came in the night the way a careful hand lays gauze, thin, even, ready to hide as much as it heals. By dawn, the roofs in town wore a quiet brightness, and the alley furs dropped a slow, persistent sift that made the trash cans sound faintly musical. I heated my fingers around the thermos, calibrated the altimeter to the courthouse benchmark one last time, and drove toward the bridge under a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to be weather or daylight. The plan, such as it was, had shrunk overnight. I would cross only if the creek told me it could be crossed without pride, touch the first slope where her pencil said the switchbacks began, and turn around if the ground story went soft. At the bridge, the deck rang in that familiar hollow way, and the plaque kept lying in its handsome bronze. The watch held the number I expected for once, which felt like being apologized to by something that can't talk. Upstream, the bench wore a lace of white at its edges, and a darker bruise where feet had no business. I checked cam A, cam B, cam C without removing the cards, just watching the battery readouts blink their small reliabilities. I told the bench I'd be back for them, and walked down to the crossing at the shale wall to listen. The creek's voice had gone lower and more serious overnight, less chatter, more intent. The stepping stones that had invited me the afternoon before were a little darker, slick where skim ice had come and gone and come again. I stood there breathing and let the arithmetic do its work. 2 long steps onto honest boulders, a short tide of water to the shins if I misjudged, a landing on the far bank where the soil wore a crust a boot might read as truth. I waited for the gust that would make me wobble, didn't feel it, and crossed with my hands held in a way that made no sense to anyone watching, and perfect sense to me. On the far bank, the duff cracked under my weight like a thin pane of glass under a feather. The smell was what the night had promised, cedar and snow and the faint mineral sweetness from the north aspect that had no business being so strong. I felt the slope in the ankles before I saw it, that clean uphill pull that puts a line in your breath. I raised the baseplate compass and took a bearing to the notch, then to a fur with a lightning scar I could feel through my glove even before I touched it. The brass compass lingered 2 degrees east again, the kind of petty betrayal that grows teeth later. I pocketed both and bent to the ground, looking for what any honest trail leaves after winter. A depression where feet taught the soil a lesson the snow repeats, a borrowed line in the grass, a stone with its bright side turned wrong. Nothing. Only the slope, brushed with a skiff of powder that hid and revealed in alternating answers. Her vellum said the first switchback cut, left across a shallow runnel, and then doubled back to a small platform the width of a truck bed. The ground said there was a runnel here, yes, and a natural ledge 10 paces above, but the skin of snow had settled without showing the tiny steps a foot makes, in a place used more than once. I walked the angle I would have cut if I'd been the crew chief 50 years ago. No scuff. I looked for nails or shims along a rotten stump that might have held a blaze. Only lichen and a history of storms. The hand-drawn line in the hillside's shoulder matched in a way that made me feel the back of my neck warm. Then they slipped, as if paper in place had agreed to disagree by a fixed, sly amount. I gave the slope what a slope wants: patience. 30 paces along the supposed first traverse, I stopped and looked downslope to fix the creek in memory as a blue-gray ribbon where the air felt thinner. The altimeter watch ticked up a meter without my boots moving. I waited. It dropped half a meter and held. I wrote the numbers on the back of my glove with pencil and rubbed the wood lightly with my thumb as if that would lock the graphite in. I placed one trail cam facing back down the line of my ascent. If I was fooling myself, I wanted the camera to see how. The second I set above the imagined corner where the first switchback would have pivoted under her pencil. The third I kept clipped to my chest rig like a companion not ready to leave the truck. The ledge where the second traverse should have run wore a tangle of sword fern laid flat by the first snow. All the fronds pointed the same way from a gust that must have scoured the slope before dawn. Under that flattened green, the ground had a strange spring to it, as if the top layer had been lifted and set back slightly wrong. I pressed with my palm and felt a cold emanation that had no business so close to the surface. Spring water, likely. And yet the thermometer reading came back tidier than thaw deserves. 7 degrees where my handprint had pressed, 3 at the duff, 5 inches upslope, a seam you could measure without embarrassment. When I looked up, the firs against the sky wobbled in the kind of heat shimmer you see over asphalt in August, then steadied, and I had to remind myself to breathe through my nose. Breadcrumbs were piling up in a way that makes you stupid if you let them. The delayed echo from the day before had lived here somewhere. I clapped once, feeling silly, then again, watching for the tiny time a hand needs to be a clock. The return came clean from the shale wall, as honest as the watch face. Toward the notch it dragged, a soft smear that washed in late. I recorded the times in the margin of my mind and gave up pretending the watch could make these tests more than ritual. I found, after 20 minutes of reading the slope and being read in return, a sort of human sign I was almost happy not to find. A length of flagging tape, sun-bleached to a whisper of pink, half swallowed by moss at knee height. I lifted it, and it parted like tissue, old and unloved. No recent crew had worked this face. Whatever had been done here had been done long enough ago that the forest had learned to speak over it without raising its voice. When I finally put my boot on what I told myself was the second switchback's turn, the snow gave and the soil below was too smooth. A trail that's been used accepts pressure and records it in 1,000 small decisions the ground makes. This felt like a memory of a trail, or the world's idea of one. I took 2 careful steps along the line my mother had drawn, then 3, then stopped because my stomach couldn't parse the way the horizon leaned. The creek's voice got flatter, and the wind above me made a sound like a taut string plucked once. A glint from the canopy flashed, and didn't. I was standing on a terrace that matched her pencil exactly, and also did not exist. I retreated a pace and something changed under my heel, a soft shift like settling flour. I crouched and brushed the snow with my glove, and the powder skated off a surface that had been packed and thawed and packed again. The pattern was fine, repeating, not a boot or a deer. Squares perhaps, or diamonds, too small for humans, too regular for any animal that lives here. I blinked, and the wind moved, and the snow fell back in to say I hadn't seen what I knew I had. I took a photograph that showed nothing useful, and another that I would later stare at until the pixels quit. The brass compass, when I lifted it to check my own steadiness, swung and held east of the base plate by the same 2-degree insistence, then ticked farther and came back as if a thin hand had brushed it. I brought the lid hinge in line with the traverse and waited. The needle trembled, pointed not along the switchback but to a patch of trees a few meters off, where the ground went darker under their drip. I went there because you do, even when you're tired of being fetched like a dog by tools that can't possibly be wanting anything. The dark patch let my boot heel sink, and then didn't. Under the snow, the soil felt armored. I scraped with the edge of the base plate and exposed a black crust slick with a thin shine. Not ice, but wet mineral. Not natural asphalt. The smell was wrong. Not tar. Something water had fed. Something the ground had learned to make in a seam where pressure changed. I listened. The bench below rattled with a gust traveling against itself. A hollow clubhouse sound the creek makes at mid-level. Up here, the air had gone still for the span of 3 long breaths. I could hear the quiet clicks of the trail cam's PIR waking and sleeping on my chest, the watch tick in my wrist bones, and, once, the tiny metallic distant tap that turns your jaw cold because it's not a bird, not a twig, not a rock. It came from the line above. At the elevation her pencil had refused to continue. I took one step that way, then did not take the second. On the way back down, I made myself walk the exact path of my ascent, heel to toe, counting to keep the body from rushing toward the creek like a thought you want to be rid of. At the runnel, I crouched again and set a camera under a sword fern with the lens peeking through like an eye. It would watch the terrace that existed and did not, and tell me if my memory was fair. I felt the old guilt for leaving anything here, and then the older knowledge that you sometimes learn by stepping away, not in. The crossing back was simple, made complicated by respect. My boot touched the far stone and held. The creek shouldered past with the attitude of a patient laborer, asking only that you not drop your tools in it. On the bench, the air regained its little eddies, the smell pocket cleared my head, and the altimeter quit playing tricks. I harvested Camby's card because I didn't trust the weather to like my questions and left the others to their assignment. At the truck I sat with the vellum and the printed quad and my notes and drew what I had not expected to draw. A shaded patch where the first switchbacks should have been and a dotted line where my feet had actually gone, ending at a dark spot under a drip line that did not belong on any honest map. Back at the bridge, because I couldn't help myself, I set the brass compass on the plaque beside the base plate again and watched the small difference open like a door and then close as if embarrassed. The plaque's numbers were the same lies. The creek kept its counsel. I wrote 2 words on the back of my glove, where I would see them when I turned the wheel: return slower. The act of writing them steadied something the day had tried to tilt. At home, the attic gave me its usual lung and exhale. The dry bag set its oval on the floorboard, and then, as if keeping a private promise, laid a second faint oval just to the east of the first. Under the lamp, her vellum looked both braver and more cautious than the slope had felt under my boots. I traced the penciled miles with my finger and stopped where her line had stopped, in the firs. The house creaked in a way I'd learned not to mind. The altimeter on my wrist climbed 1 meter and then forgot, and I held my breath until it remembered me again. I laid her vellum flat under the attic lamp and tried to imagine how the paper had ridden in her hands, the creases, the finger oils, the way a fold can become a thought. The house was a little warmer than yesterday, enough to make the pencil shine. I ran the edge of a straight edge along the fold she'd worn most, the one that crossed the trail line at mile .4. It wasn't a careless crease. She had reinforced it with tape once, and then removed the tape with a patience I recognized. It had taken the tooth off the vellum there. The fold cut the first switchbacks like a chisel, and where the crease crossed the place she had stopped the line, I could see the faintest scuff, as if she'd pressed the pencil point against the paper and thought better of it. Looking too long at a single mark makes it tell any story you wish. I closed my eyes and let the attic smell of cardboard and pencil wood rise and fall. My notes were beginning to feel like a second map, plaque off by 32 centimeters. Brass compass insisting on 2 degrees to the east. Altimeter rising when I stood still, falling when I moved downhill. A glint in the timber lingering longer than a gust should allow. A black crust under the duff that wasn't ice. A smell of spring on a north face when spring should still be shy. Each on its own could live in a week like this. Together they made the kind of pattern you start hearing in your jaw. I set the altimeter watch in log mode and wrote a time across the page, 20:41, and a phrase I use when I'm trying to stop my brain from soothing itself. Accept the wrong number, you can still draw the line. Then I reached for the brass compass the way you reach for a voice message you didn't want to hear, and popped the lid. The needle swung and held, east by the faintest sigh. I pivoted the hinge to face the wall, where, last night, the dry bag had left 2 faint ovals, and they were there again. Today the second oval sat barely east of the last second oval, as if the ghost of a puddle could drift under floorboards with a compass for a tutor. I slept badly. Wind went cat's paw against the windows, and the attic gave the sound houses make when something in them is remembering. Just before dawn, a dream of walking along graph paper startled me awake. Every line led to a fold that kept moving. By the time the coffee said the day had started, a decision had hardened. Not to push higher, not yet, but to read the first half mile as if it had arguments in its teeth. I loaded the truck with a second clipboard, a pencil sharpener shaped like a tin soldier my mother used to keep on her own table, and an old roll of butcher paper. If I couldn't explain the switchbacks where the trail should have been, maybe I could explain the bench itself, the opening that knew it was a start. The bridge met me with an honest ring and the same handsome lie. Snow had melted into a wet fringe along the curb. I calibrated the watch again to the courthouse number out of habit, took the plaque's measure out of stubbornness, and walked up to the bench with the map tube under my arm like a baton I hadn't earned. I set the butcher paper on the cribbed bank and weighted the corners with stones, then laid my mother's vellum over the first half mile and traced the crease that cut across her work. The crease made the bench look like an innkeeper's ledger line, first entries neat, later ones crowded, and a space where no one had been allowed to write. I copied the crease onto the butcher paper, then the creak, then the notch, then the ghost of the first two climbs. The wind tried to take the paper twice, and I swore silently and leaned my body over it like a roof. When I finished the sketch, I folded the butcher paper along my copy of her crease, and something bland became curious. The fold lay exactly along the bench's shaved bank, right where the old post holes lived. That alone could be coincidence. Cartographers fold for convenience, not omens. But when I held the fold to the view, the paper's edge matched the line of the cut bank as if the map knew its own place. I held the fold there and watched the creek. On the far side, the dark patch under the fur drip where the soil had felt armored lay just beyond the fold's shadow. My palm sweat made a dawn of grease along the paper's edge. The brass compass in my pocket warmed where the day couldn't. I started walking mile 0.0 to 0.2, the way you'd walk a room you're about to draw for a contractor. Pace counts, turns, eye lines to reference points. The bench gave me what it could. 3 drainage cuts abandoned years ago, a hemlock root gripping air like a fist, the lipstick smear of old flagging turned to ghost cloth. I made myself write the small things. Lichen with ivory knobs on a boulder, a woodpecker's hammered ladder on a snag, a flea bite scatter of gravel shaped like a footprint, only if you wanted it very much. The thread of cold sweet air that visited at the same spot each time I passed, as reliable as a kitchen fan. Breadcrumbs are not proof, but they're the only company you get before proof shows up. At 0918 the glint returned, and this time I wasn't anywhere near the notch. It winked from the lower slope under a cedar skirt, bobbed like a firefly in a jar, and went out. When I lifted the binoculars, the light was gone, and the needles hung in a quiet that was nearly a noise. I stopped the watch and wrote the time into a narrow rectangle I had ruled on the butcher paper, my own little ledger. The watch's log would make the altitude a line of tiny mountains, and I already knew one of the hills would rise when I stood still. I fetched Camby's cardigan because my hands wanted a task. Under the bench's shade, I loaded it into the viewer and scrolled to the morning. The camera had caught the glint too. 3 frames, each more insistent than the last, and then a dead black panel stamped with time and nothing else. A camera's version of a blink when you don't want to see. The next frame returned as if nothing had happened. The sequence showed the same 5-second jump it had made yesterday, as if time had skipped a tile on a bathroom floor. I could not decide whether that meant the camera had hiccuped or the day had. I wrote B glint, black frame, +5S again, and did not underline this time. The choice I'd been postponing kept asking to be made. Do I follow the penciled line that exists mostly as a memory in the forest and risk a thaw I can't read? Or do I trust that the map's fold is telling me to approach sideways? It is one thing to obey the note, return alone, and another to pretend the note means don't think. My mother did not teach me not to think. She taught me to leave literal tracks only when the ground volunteered to hold them. I rolled the butcher paper and tucked it under my arm. Instead of climbing, I walked the bench downhill past mile 0.0, below the old post holes in the crib. I wanted to see where a maintenance crew would have staged if they'd ever worked this trail. Backup access, rear entry, somewhere a work truck could sit and count the day. 50 meters below the bench, the service track widened into a clearing barely larger than my truck, ringed with the sort of stones grown-ups put around their fires when they mean well. Inside the ring lived the remains of a pallet, untrustworthy with rot. On one of the boards, burned in with a cheap branding iron, a line of numbers and letters. LL7, threshold. I had to squint to decide whether the extra H was a mistake or a joke. When I ran my finger over the letters, the wood gave a soft sigh of dust and revealed ghost marks on the dirt beneath. A grid of small impressions, evenly spaced, too regular for camp, too fussy for play. If a crew had been here, they had laid something in a pattern and then taken it away carefully. A lattice, a screen, a template. When I held my notebook against the grid, the spacing matched the strange checkered hardness I'd felt under the snow above the notch. It shouldn't have matched. It did. I was still kneeling over the grid when the air shifted. The smell that had been sweet sprang sharper for one breath, metal forward, then softened back to cedar and thaw soul. The wind up in the crowns made a single humming violin sound, and the creek hit a rock throat hard enough to talk back. The watch climbed, slowly, 3 meters, then stopped. I had not moved. The brass compass tugged in my pocket as if the fabric wanted to orient itself. There are decisions you make because they are right, and decisions you make because you can't stand not to. I stood, took one long look at the notch through the firs, and turned away. My mother had written her word beside the crease. A single return, darker graphite than the rest. Return can mean go back to where you started. Return can also mean come back later, when you've earned it. I walked the service track toward the lower bridge over the tributary, where the creek divides into 2 uneasy cousins. On the way, a jay flew uphill into the canopy, and then midway, changed its mind midair and flapped in place before diving, as if it had hit something invisible. The bird corrected, flew on, and scolded whatever nothing hadn't wanted it. Breadcrumb, motion arrested by a thing you can't sketch. At the lower bridge, a smaller plaque was bolted to a rail with more enthusiasm than expertise. Its stamped "Guomai" had been corrected by hand with a center punch to 0.1. I measured, because that is what I do, and the correction was closer to the truth than the stamp had been. There is a human pleasure in finding a careful fix. I took a pencil rubbing and added it to the butcher paper roll because the weight of a fact steadies the lighter part of a day. By the time I turned back toward the bench, the sky had grown a texture you could sand furniture with. Snow would come again before evening, or maybe it was already sifting beyond the ridge where the glint lived. I harvested Cam A and Cam C, left Cam B to its structural superstition, and tucked all 3 cards into separate sleeves like lab samples. In the truck, I wrote a single sentence on the top line of the day's page. Fold the map at the bench and let the bench choose. It felt like stealing an instruction from someone who'd left it in my mother's neat hand. Back in the attic, I cleared the table and unrolled the butcher paper beside the vellum. When I folded both along the crease and set them, so the edge lined with the bench's shaved bank, the penciled line to the switchbacks lay 1/2 centimeter inside the fold. On the hidden side, a trail in negative. I sat in the quiet until the house remembered it could creak. The dry bag breathed out a small, damp oval. A second oval bloomed east of it while I watched, and I didn't need a level to know the floor didn't slope that way. I wrote the 2 ovals as if they were elevations on a contour and drew a small arrow between them. The arrow pointed toward the place on the slope where my mother's line had stopped. The map sometimes takes your hand and leads you somewhere it refuses to rename. That was enough decision for one day. Morning came in that faint nickel light you get before a snow that can't decide. I laid the vellum and the butcher paper side by side once more, folded both along the bench line until the edge kissed the penciled mile 0.0 old, and traced with the back of my fingernail the negative trail, the part that lived on the hidden face of the fold. Coffee went into the thermos. The trail cam's batteries, charged from a wall that still believed its own voltage, read full. I wrote a heading at the top of the notebook, because headings make choices feel deliberate. Thermal read, north aspect, do not climb. Down at the bridge, the bronze plaque kept its little myth, but the watch, after calibration at the courthouse, agreed with the deck within 1 meter. I accepted the truce. Snow had sifted in the night and retreated. The creek held the color of hammered glass. I walked to the bench without sound where I could, counting paces to keep the brain at the right speed. At the lay-by, the air brought the green sweet odor up valley again. Clean spring, not rot, and a thin edge of metal that made my mouth taste like a coin. The gusts were irregular, carrying a high thread through the fir crowns, and then severing it until you wondered whether you'd imagined a line. I started with water, because water tells the truth if you ask it, with a tool it respects. The creek thermometer, cheap but honest, had a probe on a coiled lead. I knelt at the shale wall crossing and dipped the tip into the main flow, held it steady in the shadow where sunlight wouldn't cheat, 2.7 degrees. I waited for the numbers to stop eddying, then wrote it down. 10 meters upstream, same depth, 2.9 digs. 2 meters from the north bank, 4.8 digs, then 5.0, then 5.1. I let the probe float in that ribbon and felt the current push against the cable, as if asking a question I didn't know how to parse. The ribbon was narrow, no wider than a boot, running parallel to the bank in a way that would have carried a child's paper boat, straight as a rule, if the channel had been gentler. I stepped along the bank upstream until the ribbon cut inward and vanished under a screen of willow whips, then reappeared fixed to a different line as though a careful hand had laid thread along the water and nudged it when bored. The IR thermometer told the same story where it could. Wet stones along the north edge held to 1.7 dig, 1.8 dig. A single cobble round as a loaf sat at 6.8 dig and cooled to 6.2 digs while I watched without it touching direct sun. I tried not to be charmed by the neatness of the numbers. Order can be an invitation to believe before you should. Across the creek, above the notch, the slope still wore its uncertainty, the second switchback existing and not under a feathery skin of snow. I kept to the bench and unrolled the butcher paper on the crib bank, then copied the ribbon of warmer water onto the map with a pencil line I shaded darker as it brightened. It laid beside her vellum's unaired miles like a sentence that wanted to be spoken but knew the room. The brass compass tugged in my pocket toward the creek. I let it, set it on the butcher paper, and watched the needle find north, then slip 2 degrees east and linger there. The base plate kept its Puritan truth. I penned an arrow onto the ribbon, flow line plus warm, then another, compass drift, then struck through the second arrow because I could feel my mother laughing at me for writing like I was labeling ghosts. At 0842, a crow flew up valley against the wind with the gumption of a carpenter. Then, halfway over the notch, hinged sideways and crabbed in place as if leaning into a wall that nobody had installed. After 3 beats of wings, it shot forward again, free of whatever it had found. I raised the binoculars, nothing but fur. The delayed echo trick, my stubborn ritual, repeated its new habit. Honest, 3 seconds to the shale face, a lazy drag toward the notch that wasn't weather. I wrote it small, as if not to wake anything. I wanted the warm source, not its signature, and the creek was willing to show me more. 50 meters upstream, a side seep ran clear through moss, making minute bubbles like whispering. I followed it to where it disappeared under a lace of roots and laid the probe on the damp, 7.2 dig. In shoulder season, this aspect should give you water that lives at the air's mercy. The spring was making its own weather under the fern skirts. It fed the ribbon that hugged the bank like a guideline on the day's story. I ran my fingers through it. The cold had teeth, yes, but there was a depth to it. Clean, mineral, oddly soft. I cupped it and brought it to my nose and caught the same green sweetness I'd been smelling for days, plus the trace of iron that lived in tools. I swung the baseplate compass to see how the seep line ran relative to the valley. The needle laid along a neat 0.26 dig. The brass hung at 28 dig for a heartbeat, then tipped to 0.30 dig and back to 28 dig, like a person who knows the answer and tries not to. I slid both compasses together along the moss and noticed something I hadn't meant to. When the brass case crossed a hairline seam in the soil, the needle jumped a hair east, then settled. A seam I could barely see except by the way the water beaded on it. Darker, finer mineralization, endpoint unclear, slopeward. I marked the seam's line on the butcher paper as a dotted thread. Seam felt too soft. Joint, too proud. I wrote main man and let the day choose. The moral pressure arrived with a choice shaped like a path. Do I follow the warm ribbon across on rock, easy, seductive, brief, then climb one switchback to set a cam in the open for the night? Or do I let the cams on the bench listen longer and build a model that insults my boots? I heard my mother's pencil scratch through 30 years, the way she would stop, lay the lead to the vellum, and not press. Return alone was not the kind of alone that invites heroics. It was the kind that invites handwriting. So I did the ugly thing, the wise thing. I shadowed the warm ribbon without crossing, then dropped downstream and found a riffle where the water's voice went broad. I anchored the probe mid-channel with a split stick and looped the cable to the crib so I could read without leaning over like a fool. I set the watch's timer for 10-minute intervals and gave myself a schedule. Read, write, walk to cam B and back, read, write. Work keeps fear from inventing facts. 0910, mid-channel 2.8 dig, north edges ribbon 5.1 dig, seep 7.2 dig. 0920, mid 2.9 dig, ribbon 5.3 dig, seep 7.3 dig. 0930, mid 3.0 dig, ribbon 5.4 dig, seep 7.3 dig. Wind increased, crowns hummed, echo test unhelpfully similar. 0940, mid 3.0 dig, ribbon 5.6 dig, seep 7.4 dig. Brass compass drift greater near seam, baseplate unchanged. 0950, mid 3.1 dig, ribbon 5.8 dig, seep 7.5 dig. Camera B LED blinked slow, then fast, then normal with no change to settings. I noted B, cadence odd at 49. At At 09:52, a glint fired from the fir shadow like a tiny held breath of sun and went out. Cam B pointed to the notch, clicked a still. A J scolded. Something down in the gravel bar made a small, clean clink, as if two pebbles had chosen each other. I waited for the watch to invent altitude I hadn't earned. It stayed. I allowed myself a breath like a person. When the timer chirped again, I read the ribbon one more time, and the number came up a full degree warmer, 6.8 dig, while mid-channel held steady. That was too quick for air alone. I looked for sunlight. None. I looked for an eddy from a stone. None new. The seam's dark line under the duff had grown more visible by eye now that I knew where to look, the way a bruise shows itself after your brain has permission. I traced it with a twig and felt the twig's tip vibrate faintly, as if a tiny current had decided to borrow my nervous system. I set the twig down because that's not a test, that's a mood. There's an impulse, when you sense something honest and strange, to put a flag on it and call the day good. I compromised. I crossed at the shale wall again, respectful, stepped to the north bank, and set a single cam low under a cedar skirt at the height of my knee, lens angling along the seam's projected run. I anchored it to a root with cord, until the cord told me with its tension that it would hold. I left a laminated card in a zip bag pinned under a small rock at the bench. My name, my cell, my plan on the clock face, and a note that I would pull the cams by noon tomorrow if weather allowed. If someone official saw it, I wanted the conversation to be about method, not trespass. On the way back to the truck, the delayed echo snapped once to an honest return and then went slack again like a belt that needs a hole you haven't punched. The brass compass stopped arguing for a full minute. The altimeter watch dropped 2 meters while I walked downhill and then climbed one as I stood looking at the bridge. A wrong pair of numbers so symmetrical I had to laugh once in the throat, because if I didn't, I might make them a story with teeth. In town, I bought 2 liters of distilled water because protocol likes control. Back in the attic, I set a stainless bowl on the table, poured the water, checked it with the same probe, room temp recorded, and then, while the attic air kept its dull warmth, I pinched a teaspoon of creek silt I'd brushed from my cuff into the bowl. The probe didn't care. When I dipped the twig that had trembled near the seam into the bowl, nothing. When I held the brass compass over the bowl, the needle behaved like a soldier on inspection. I wrote, "No parlor trick," in the margin and drew a box around it to keep my brain honest. The dry bag set its oval on the floor again, as polite as a tired boot. A second oval slid east of it as I watched, slow as the movement of a second hand in a school clock that counts its way to recess. I marked both on the butcher paper where I'd sketched the creek ribbon, and then, because the brain loves company, I sketched a little arrow between the ovals, then an echo line between the bench and the notch, then a tiny square where the seam sat under the cedar skirt. When I'd finished, the figure looked like something you could give to a crew and say, "Build this," except the part you were asking them to build was a behavior in water, not a structure in wood. Night gathered. The attic breathed. I lay the brass compass closed on the vellum and let my hand rest on the lid until the case took my temperature. I thought of her writing "return" beside the crease, and how a person can mean 3 things with 1 word, and be right about all of them. I set the alarm on the watch for first blue, not full day. If the creek wanted to talk in the cold hours, I would listen while the ribbon made a line the map would accept. The alarm found me in the dark hour, when the town's dogs hadn't yet negotiated their truce. I dressed in the kitchen light and carried the maps in the dry bag like I was escorting someone elderly down the stairs. The sky over the pass had iron filings in it. The truck's tires hissed once across a sprinkle that couldn't decide whether to be snow. I parked at the bridge and stood on the deck, long enough to feel the bronze plaque's cold come through my gloves. The altimeter watch, freshly calibrated to the courthouse reading, held its number steady as if to demonstrate good faith after yesterday's antics. The brass compass floated its stubborn 2 degrees east and then pretended not to be proud of it. Up on the bench, the air had sharpened. The creek spoke lower, like a person leaning, so you would have to listen. I walked to the lay-by and stood where the smell of green came down valley, and the slight iron note pricked the back of my tongue. The cams I'd left on this side blinked their small, polite signatures, awake, listening. Across the water, under the cedar skirt where I'd tucked a camera yesterday, a trickle drew a continuous fine line down the bank, the kind of persistent wet that writes its own sentence. The seam's dark thread showed if you knew the trick of soft eyes. I started with the warm ribbon again because routines tame the urge to leap. The probe held to 5.1 degrees at the north edge, while mid-channel clung to 3.0 degrees. The seep tested at 7.4 degrees, and I didn't let the small neatness of that number lull me. I traced the ribbon upstream without crossing, counting paces, reading micro swirl, rolling stones with my toe, and putting them back where they'd agreed to sit. 27 paces up, the ribbon tightened to the width of my hand, left the bank like a line changing its mind, cut a diagonal for 4 meters, then tucked back under the north side exactly where the bench line, when I folded the butcher paper last night, cast its shadow. I stopped because the air smelled briefly of struck flint, and that is not a smell I associate with creeks unless something is pretending to be ordinary. The notch across the way was quiet, no glints yet, only dripping, but the undersong of the place had changed. I clapped at the shale wall, got the honest 1.3 seconds. I clapped toward the notch and waited for the drag. It came, lazy as before, then, on the third clap, snapped to an almost early return that fell on my ear like a question asked too quickly. I tried again, spaced my hands, timed on the watch because I can't help it. Late, late, early, late. The forest was tapping back with a rhythm that wouldn't fit in the notebook. I told myself I would harvest the cams first and save the climb for last. Cam A's card came out gritty with the fine dust that benchwind breeds. The viewer took it without fuss. Juncos hopped their shabby precision. Deer again, their delicate knees lifting like words you choose carefully. Regular life, repeated at faithful intervals. Cam C near the seam showed its inventory of understory. Nothing, then the fern tips leaning as if pressed by a palm again, held, let go. I made myself watch it twice in case I had invented the hold. The timestamp stayed religious this time. Cam B, the notch watcher, loaded with its slight disgruntlement about being asked to know too much. The morning's first hour was a long, dark poem of wind and fur. At 0619, a small coin of light winked where light doesn't go at that hour. At 0620, the frame went black again, stamped with time, and no picture, then returned. At 0632, something else lived in the image that I could not honestly name. Not a person, not animal, not bloom. At the base of a fir about knee height, a rectangle of paler shadow sat against the bark, edges too straight to be fungus, too ragged to be new paint. It stayed for 2 frames, grew lighter as if a cloud had moved, then dissolved back into bark. I rewound, went frame by frame until the tiny LCD made my eyes ache, and pressed my cheek into my shoulder to steady my hand. The rectangle was not quite plumb. It canted, barely, like an old sign set in a hole that widened by years. In the second frame, as the light strengthened, the rectangle's face caught something I could translate only as numbers rubbed out long ago, but deciding to be seen. I leaned closer until the screen pixelated. 0, maybe. Then something like a dot, as if a decimal once lived between units. Another 0, and to the right, a suggestion of a curve that wanted to be a 5 or a 6. The camera wasn't lying. It was only telling the truth with a mouthful of snow. The notion that there had ever been a mile marker up there hit me in the ribs. Crews don't put formal mile markers on little mountain switchbacks unless they mean to maintain them, unless a ledger somewhere needs its numbers. My mother's pencil had written mile 0.0 old at the bench. She hadn't invented that language. Someone had started counting at the shaved bank with the post holes, and kept counting up the slope where I had felt a terrace that existed and did not. And if there was a marker at roughly half a mile, 0.5, the fold across her vellum made that spot fall on the hidden face of the map, where a hand had paused and thought better of pressing. I put the viewer away and took the cameras down to the truck one by one, not because I was finished with them, but because carrying them gave me something to do while the decision gathered. Twice on the walk, I stopped because the altimeter ticked upward 3 meters while my feet refused to admit motion. Each time, the number settled back as if it had been a nervous joke. Snow freckles began to appear in the air, single throttle blips in a quiet engine, riding a wind that shifted from south to north on a whim. At the bench again, the practical voice in my head, and in hers, took over. If there had been mile markers, the nails would be rotten, but the holes would endure in the furs. The paint would be gone, but the ghost of white would live on the gray bark where the rain never quite ironed it out. I crossed at the shale wall, careful, making a rhythm with my breath to keep pride out of my legs. The north bank met me with that coin taste again. I climbed the first height only as far as safety made me a reasonable partner, scanning trunks and understory at knee height, then waste. The painted ghosts live where you least want to kneel. At the big fur I'd marked out of habit, a lightning scar that felt tender even years later, I found what any honest search would deliver. Old wounds with their own reasons, mosses with opinions, the patience of bark. But 10 meters above, at a smaller cedar with a skirt gone mossy, I ran my hand along the trunk at shin level and felt flake. My thumbnail lifted a curl. Beneath, paler wood peered out, less weathered. I turned the light of my headlamp sideways, skimmed it along the surface, and the trunk answered with a sigh of low contrast. A rectangle lived there, indistinct as fogged glass, taller than it was wide. I didn't touch more. I shifted my stance, and the glint I'd chased for days teased an eye-level slap at the corner of the shape. Not bright, just insistent. A tiny ridge of something, old varnish, caught what little light got through the canopy and threw it back in a small domestic miracle. Numbers? I don't trust numbers that beg to be seen. I waited, let my breathing quiet, let the watch convince itself of whatever barometric tale it preferred. When the wind breathed out and the firs let the world hold still, the rectangle's face became a faint, patient ledger. I read nothing at first. Then a dent resolved into a dot. To its left, the suggestion of a 0. To its right, another 0, and the fragment of a curved digit that insisted on 6 when I asked it not to insist on anything. 0.6 lived there in the bark's memory, or my mind wanted it so badly it would engrave it on a living tree. I spoke the number softly, not as a claim, but as a courtesy, in case the people who once carried their day up here wanted to be counted. The delayed echo trick sent its report a moment later. Clean, late, clean, like someone tapping once on a 3-pane window and then drawing a fingertip across. I stepped back, turned away so I wouldn't do the foolish thing, and pressed my palm against the rectangle like a child at a museum. And that's when my boot found the wrongness, under the snow again. Packed and thawed, packed again. A repeating texture too small for boots, too regular for ungulates, too patient for chance. I crouched, let the glove brush the skin off the snow, and there it was. The same fine grit I'd felt yesterday. Less distinct, but still living under a dusting. Squares small as postage stamps, pressed into the soil as if something had rested there a long time and been lifted away with care. The spacing matched the palette grid down by the lower clearing. I put my hand over one square, and the cold came into my palm with the gentleness of spring water. It cost me indiscipline not to take a rubbing, not to scrape, not to dig in a place that was already telling me as much as I had the right to know today. The note on her vellum, the penciled return, had not been a flourish. It had been a rule she kept making for me. I set a cam hidden in the cedar skirt, lens just low enough to read the rectangle without making a shrine of it. I oriented it not with the brass compass, but with the base plate, because whatever argument the brass wanted never overruled safety. I wrote the time, the bearing, the rough elevation, and the smallest description I could bring myself to trust. Possible marker face, bark discoloration at shin height, glint when wind steadies. On the way down, I counted the steps twice and got different numbers, which irritated me until I realized the slope itself was changing the way it presented its indentation under the snow. At the creek, the warm ribbon held to 5.5 degrees, like a conversation at last call. I crossed at the shale and stood on the bridge and put the two compasses beside each other on the plaque one more time, because I can't help my superstition. The base plate pointed where north is. The brass needle found its 2 degrees east and held for a full minute. No tremble, no apology. The watch reported the deck 2 meters higher than it had 10 minutes ago, and then climbed another half meter, as if the day were taking a deep breath. The creek's voice flattened for the span of one sentence, and then brightened. In the attic, I spread the vellum and the butcher paper and penciled a tiny rectangle on the hidden side of the fold where the cedar lived. I wrote, above it, without decoration, the numbers I had allowed myself to want, 0.6. The dry bag set its damp oval on the floorboard, and, slowly, a second oval budded to the east. Not far, not dramatic, just far enough to register as intention. I made a small arrow between them, and, because the child in me insisted, drew a dot between the 2 zeros on the butcher paper in the same dull graphite my mother had used when she needed to feel the point of a day. A period you can trip over if you're not watching your feet. Evening came down the valley like someone drawing a graphite stick across paper, dark to darker in one pass. I parked at the bridge and sat with the engine off until the last heat in the block surrendered. then zipped the dry bag and shouldered it like an answer. The plan was as narrow as I could make it. Let the cameras do the walking, read the creek while the air cooled, harvest cards after full dark, and resist the kind of curiosity that asks your boots to solve what your hands can measure later. The altitude on the watch matched the deck within a meter after I took a breath and let the pressure settle. I put the brass compass in my left pocket, out of easy reach, like a kind word you didn't entirely trust, and kept the base plate on a lanyard where I could feel its corners against my chest. The bench held the day's leftover brightness in its duff. Each step found a small dusting of melt that didn't squeak like snow and didn't slop like rain, the shoulder season compromise that makes a person careful. Far upstream, a limb cracked. The creek turned that sound into something thin and conversational, a murmur translated twice. At the lay-by, the clean green smell came as it always did, with that small iron suggestion that made me think first of nails and then of streambed stones. Cam A blinked a slow welcome. I let it be. Cam C, the low understory watcher by the seam, wore a skirt of cedar needles from the afternoon wind. I brushed them away and saw my reflection for an instant in the lens, a dim oval shaped like doubt. Across the creek I could make out the cedar with the not quite rectangle and the small steady dark where the camera I'd set in its skirt would be waiting. The slope above it had the kind of hush that belongs to rooms where you don't speak unless you're certain of your verb. I took a sequence of temperature reads because numbers passed the time without offending the place. Mid-channel at the riffle, 3.2 degrees. The ribbon along the north edge, 5.5. The seep above, where moss breathed with its own clock, 7.3 and holding. When I dipped the probe again at the ribbon and held it longer than I needed to, the number drifted to 5.7 and then fell back, as if something had pressed a thumb to the thermometer's thought, and then let go. My notebook held the times in a line that would look like patience when I read it later, and like delay if I told the truth. On the bench, I laid out the butcher paper only long enough to find the fold with my finger and whisper mile 0.0 old under my breath. Foolish comfort. The wind stalled as if the valley had gone to put a kettle on. I clapped once at the shale wall and got the honest return. Toward the notch, the echo arrived lazy, and then, on the second try, early again by a blink. I don't have a better word than early for what that felt like. It reached my ear before it could have, and my throat tightened the way it does when you swallow without water. I waited for dark the way a person waits for a bus in a town with no schedule, standing, sitting, standing again, listening in a circle. Small events came to fill the ledger. A vole stitched a fine line between sword ferns and was gone. A jay tested the air with a string of small opinions. Far up valley a dog barked once, a single sound with no follow. The altimeter crept down a meter, and then up 2 for the 30 steps I did not take. The base plate's north held like a promise. In the pocket, the brass case warmed to my leg until I forgot it, then remembered it when a draft slid down the bench at ankle height, and the pocket felt briefly cool. When the slope was nothing but layered shadow and the creek had the solitary pitch it gets, after the last hiker's headlights clear the pass, I crossed at the shale. The stones were darker than they had been at noon, but honest under my soles. I could smell the cedar skirt before I could see it, a damp volume in the air where needles have been falling longer than I've been taking notes. At the fury with the scuffed lightning scar, I stopped and let my breath fall in step with the drip. The rectangle on the cedar trunk did not declare itself. It only refused to be entirely bark. I eased to one knee and slid the card from the camera without angling the lens toward my headlamp beam, a habit born from not wanting to see my own face at the wrong time. Back across the creek, in the cone of the bench's thin light, I set the cards in the viewer one by one. Cam A showed ordinary night truths, the sort that make you feel correctly unimportant. Moths like falling ash. The cold glitter of a spider thread as it decided not to be a bridge, the shadow of a deer that didn't want to be a noun. Cam C recorded the understory with its mild stubbornness, stillness, then the fern tips bowing together as if they had heard a word just above my understanding, held for 2 heartbeats, and released. Cam B asked for more of me. The first frame after dusk carried a proper darkness, the kind cameras make when they want to be useful and yet won't lie. Then a sequence at the cedar, bark, then not bark, then the faintest table of a face that numbers once knew. On the third clip, a grainy rectangle let go of 2 ghosts, and I found myself tilting the viewer like that would help. The first ghost lived where I expected, a 0 with the shape of a mouth. To its right, the dot, then a 0 again, less certain. Farther right, the half curve that wanted to be a 6, The same persuasion as morning. The new thing was below, a second line of scratch memory, too faint to claim as text but persistent enough to trouble my hands. I breathed out and let the clip run. The rectangle did a small thing I can't draw. It brightened by a narrow margin while the background did not. The way a window looks different from a wall at night when a light turns on in another room. The next clip blacked out with the timestamp still marching, the camera's way of keeping faith while the day chose not to. Then a frame flashed so fast I had to back up 3 times. In it, a set of points arranged themselves along the soil just beneath the cedar skirt, perfect on the screen for less than a second, and gone. I froze the frame and leaned close until the pixels made a little city. The points were bright where the rest of the ground was dull, and they lay in a grid. I will not pretend otherwise. Small squares like the pressed texture I had palmed under the snow. The spacing matched the palette down in the clearing, as surely as my thumbnail matched its own crescent. They were not present in the frame before or after. I told myself I had seen an artifact. Then I told myself that a grid appearing and disappearing under a cedar is not the kind of artifact a cheap camera invents for its entertainment. I wrote the time and did not write the word proof. When the bench air lifted and moved in a single ribbon toward the notch, the brass compass in my pocket tugged like a dog that hears its name 2 rooms away. I tried to ignore it. I failed, took it out, let the lid click, watched the needle find north as we teach children to do, then slip east the same 2 degrees and hold. I turned the case until the hinge pointed at the cedar and felt foolish. The needle lagged a beat behind the movement, then steadied. I brought the base plate up beside it and set the edge along the river's run just to give my hands something hard to touch. The base plate said what it always says. The brass wanted 2 degrees more of what it has asked me for since the attic. I closed it like you close a mouth you love and don't intend to argue with. The watch chimed the hour. I slid the cards into their sleeves and let the bench lead me back to the bridge. Somewhere upstream, a small stone knocked another. The creek turned that meeting into a polite knock-knock that did not ask to be answered. At the deck, I set the viewer case on the bronze plaque and pressed both palms to the metal until my fingers went cold. I put the base plate on it and watched its arrow lay like a measured sentence. I placed the brass beside it and watched the needle hover, then move that tiny exhausted distance to the east, as if that east had been coined just here and now by the 2 of us, complicit. In the attic, I turned no other light on. The lamp above the table is a circle made for paper, and the parts of a person that slow down around pencil. I spread the vellum and placed the butcher paper fold edge to fold edge, the hidden trail against the bench's truth. The rectangles I had sketched at 6/10 of a mile looked almost convinced of themselves. I set the altimeter watch down and listened to its ticks become metronome again. The dry bag laid its oval where it has been laying it for nights, and, as if steadying me, laid the second oval to the east a breath later. I penciled 2 small marks on the floorboard with a carpenter's pencil. I keep exactly for sins like that, and felt the petty relief of giving a behavior a place to return to. The cards went into the laptop only after I told myself not to expect anything new. Cam B's grid stutter waited for my key command like a swimmer, waiting for the second the surface breaks. The bright squares were more orderly on the bigger screen, and, because bigger makes strangers familiar, a little less frightening. I counted quickly, 4 across visible, maybe 5 if the frame had been wider, 6 down to the edge, then stopped, because lists aren't kindness, and I had promised myself not to rename anything tonight. I clicked forward 1 frame. The grid was gone. I clicked back. It did not come back. I wrote the time again, then wrote creek ribbon 5.7 at the same minute, without knowing why those should share a line. I don't have a better ending for the night than the smallest decision. I stood, took the brass compass in both hands, laid it on the vellum above mile 0.0 old so the lid hinge pointed at the fold, and pressed the case gently until the lid made contact with the paper. I left it there, warm in my palm heat, like a coin on a ledger. The house exhaled through the attic hatch. Something settled in the walls the way houses settle when their maps have been carried up and laid down, and asked to be more than paper. The watch clicked 1 more tick forward and the number on the altimeter face climbed a meter, then went back. I let it, and for the first time since the bench had recognized me, I wasn't in a hurry to turn the page. In the morning, I built myself a desk out of the attic, vellum at center, butcher paper to the right, laptop to the left with an old external drive that holds the sort of files you keep because you think someday a question will deserve them. I spun up the drive and pulled the LiDAR tile I'd downloaded years ago for this township. A grayscale hillshade that makes the Cascades look like someone breathed across ash. The bench showed in crisp relief. The shaved bank with the post holes looked like a knife line. The notch carried the faint bruise of windthrow healed over. But at about 0.6 of a mile above the bench, something the forest should say in contour lines chose not to. The slope's texture hushed there. No chatter of gullies, no polite whisper of micro-terraces, just a small, even softness, as if the earth had pressed pause. Contours go quiet when a scan is bad, or when the angle of sunlight fools your eye, or when a slope has been smoothed by a glacier, which this one has not. I flicked between the tile and the USGS quad, then to the older edition for stubbornness. The older map kept the slope lively. The newer one softened it in the same spot as the LiDAR. My mother's trail pencil stopped just shy of that hush, her fold crossing it like a bandage. I needed a field truth that wasn't paper. I packed the dry bag with the trail cams and, this time, my mother's small silver clinometer, the suunto she used to keep clipped to her vest. Its face had the sort of scuffs a person earns, the sort that make your fingers behave better. I added a pocket transit I don't bring out unless the day asks politely, a staff of fiberglass segments that click together, and a tape. The altimeter watch blinked its small confidence on my wrist. The brass compass lay heavy in the pocket of my jacket, without needing to say anything. At the bridge, I calibrated the watch against the courthouse number, because I'm superstitious about starting without humility. The plaque was the same handsome liar. Wind combed the furs with a dry zipper sound. I walked up to the lay-by, ran my hand along the cribstones, and felt the green iron smell slide down valley in a thin ribbon that tasted like nickels on my tongue. Cam A blinked its single red heartbeat. Cam C watched the scene with its polite attention. Across the creek, the cedar skirt with the faint rectangle stood as if it needed me to lower my voice. I crossed at the shale with the tape-slung bandolier style, set the staff on the far bank, and built a small transect up the first 60 meters of slope by habit. Stake at the toe, staff at 10-meter increments, slope angle with the clinometer from each station. Notes as if I were being graded by a woman who still believed in pencil. 10 meters up, 18 degern, 20, 24 deg, 30, 26 deg. Then, at 40, the number softened irrationally, 20 deg, while the ground under my boots felt steeper. I checked twice more. The clinometer wouldn't budge. The ground wouldn't agree. At 50, the angle returned to 25 degrees, as if whatever hush lived here had thinned out. I walked that 40-meter station in a slow arc, and the reading stayed wrong over a patch as broad as a pickup hood. When I knelt and pressed my palm to the soil, the cold came up gentler, the way it did at the seam by the creek. I set a small flag of dull tape at the station, and marked a dot on the butcher paper. 40 minisor, angle quiet. The moral pressure arrived the way it always does in small weather. I was alone. My note said I would be. The slope wanted someone more gullible than I felt like being. I kept the measurements from the shoulder, not the belly, stood as often as I knelt, and triangulated not with my body but with the transit. The little scope showed me the cedar and the rectangle at 0.6, canted by a shade I could not pretend was wind. I called out bearings to no one and wrote them down anyway. Angles that made a neat triangle until one didn't. That one fell short by 2 degrees, and when I checked the base plate against the transit's truth, it held steady while the brass needle, back at the truck in my pocket, I could feel as a suggestion against my thigh, an uninvited guest remembering where the chairs go. Sound carried differently mid-slope. The creek lost its thread in the firs. Wind in the crowns became the whole song. I tried the clap at the shale wall out of irritation and got a valid return delayed by cold air that had moved down valley since morning. Toward the notch, the echo was late, then early, then late. Its rude rhythm the same as last night's. Like whatever stone trick there is up there refuses to keep time unless you leave. I wrote the times in tiny numbers along the staff marks because the page of the notebook was tired of hosting my superstition. At the rectangle, I didn't do anything you'd need to defend to a ranger. My hand hovered, my headlamp stayed off. I side-lit the bark with a shielded flashlight and watched the face present itself again like someone turning toward a window in another room. The 0 showed as dent and then sheen. The dot in the middle took its posture. The final digit's curve still wanted to be 6. Below, the second faint line wasn't text, I told myself. It was weather. Maybe the crew had once painted a subtitle, elevation, or a unit that meant something before this ledger was closed. My vow held. No rubbings, no scrapings. I set the camera to watch again from a slightly lower angle, thinking about how a painter would have stood, knees braced, a brush in his glove, someone telling him, hurry before the weather takes it. I went hunting for the loudest quiet on the slope. At the 40-meter station where the angle dropped out of character, I pressed my palm to the ground again and mapped the strange give with boot heels around the station. The fine grid weighted under 1/8 of an inch of snow as if counting, its squares a little less crisp than 2 days ago, but more loyal than memory should allow. The spacing matched the pallet ghost down below. I could prove that to myself by laying the tape across 4 squares, 40 centimeters from center to center. A contractor's number, honest and ugly. I didn't write proof. I wrote, pattern persists, 40 centimeters, because sometimes a softer sentence keeps you out of trouble. Midday, the wind settled and a glint struck once from the fir shade and died. I followed the line of it with the transit and wrote the bearing and read it again. Got the same, wrote that too. The altimeter watch chimed a log point at the hour, and then climbed 3 meters while the transit's bubble held steady, as if the air had been plucked like a taut wire, and chosen my wrist to report the vibration. I breathed out and let the number do what it wanted. When it fell back, I recorded the high as a small superscript, the way my mother would, to remind myself that numbers sometimes live in the same sentence without agreeing on verbs. I stayed longer than I should have on a thaw day. At the bench, I told the cams to keep their assignment. At the bridge, the plaque and I pretended not to be in an argument. Back in the attic, I pulled the lighter hillshade up beside a blank sheet of paper and tried something I hadn't done since I was too young to know better. I traced the hush. The quiet patch on the slope, the one the contours refused to articulate, took a shape under the vellum that wasn't a rectangle, wasn't a circle, an oval with a small notch like a thumbprint. When I laid the trail fold against it so the bench line and the fold's sharp edge lined exactly, the hush sat half on the hidden face, half on the public one, like a thing that can't decide whether it belongs in the story. I called Walt because his name lived in her margins, and because he is the kind of man who can tell you you're being over clever before you spend a night proving it. He answered in the voice that Diesel makes in a shop. I told him where I was, where the pencil stopped, where the fold cut. He snorted once and let it ride. They only painted tents on trails in those years if they needed crews to cut drainage or survey timber, he said. You won't find plastic posts. You'll find ghosts and a ledger that's been cached. Don't go prying. You hear me? I said I heard him. He gave me a silence that meant more. You'll smell the manganese when you get too clever. Get your numbers and leave it room. Big Night climbed the rafters early. I set the brass compass on the vellum just above mile .0 old, hinged toward the fold, not as an altar, just as a habit. The needle did what it has done since we started talking. I don't like the word we, but the tool has adopted it, finding north and then arguing east by 2 degrees and resting there like a dog that learned the length of its leash. The altimeter watch ticked and made a staircase of pressure on its graph, 3 tiny risers before the hour, 2 after, a pattern timid as a child tapping the table. I pulled the cards. The bench cams gave me their inventory of honest night. Moths and juncos, a small parade of stillness. The cedar skirt camera, the rectangle watcher, had a sequence that made the breath stop not out of fear, but out of recognition. At 1912, the rectangle brightened by a hair, same as before. At 1913, the face held. At 1914, the lower line, the one I had refused to promote to text, arranged itself into 3 dashes, then a gap, then a dash. Not text, not numbers. An underline that had chosen to remember itself. I counted off the seconds in the clip and found a neat 30. Then I clicked ahead 1 frame to the camera's black stamp habit. Time, 19:15:05. The 5-second skip returned, like a coin dropping where it always has. When I closed the laptop, the attic lamp made a halo on the table that I wanted to believe could protect work. The dry bag set its damp oval. The second oval slid east by the quietest measure, barely more than yesterday, barely enough to claim as movement. I penciled 2 new marks on the floorboard and placed today's date between them. 4, the month, and a line because the number was not the point. A map won't name some things while they're working. It will only let you set pins around them and write quiet. I'm not in love with this kind of suspense, but I respect it. Tomorrow, if the thaw lets me, I'll run a longer transect across the hush. staff stations every 10 meters until the slope quits lying about its angle, and read the seam under the cedar with my ears instead of a probe. I will not press my palm to the rectangle. I will stand where crews stood when the ledger was new, and let the air around 6/10 of a mile tell me whether counting is still welcome here. The map folds the same way no matter how many times you open it. The bench accepts the weight of paper without complaint. The creek picks a temperature and then remembers your name. Tonight, the contours have chosen to be quiet. I copied the quiet into the margin so my hand would know how to carry it. The storm arrived looking undecided and left no doubt. By mid-morning, the ridge wore a column of bruised light, and the wind, clean at dawn, now dragged a freight hum across the crowns that made the bench talk to itself. I stood at the bridge and let the deck's cold come up through the boots. The plaque shone like a polished story. The altimeter watch, recalibrated to the courthouse benchmark on my way out of town, landed a meter low and then decided to behave. I took the meter as a courtesy, not a promise. The brass compass warmed in my pocket until I forgot it, and then remembered it when the first pellets of Gropel ticked the rail like small decisions. I'd stacked today's method the night before, so I wouldn't have room for bravery. Run a longer transect across the quiet patch, staff stations at 10-meter intervals, clinometer readings, echo checks at the same points, temperature ribbon reads at the creek on the hour, harvest cards if the window closed. The Suunto clinometer swung on its thong like a small moon. The fiberglass staff clicked together with the sound of diligence. I set the butcher paper roll under the truck's wiper so it wouldn't ride with me until I had earned it. Up on the bench, the world smelled green as iron again. The spring licorice sweetness and the coin tang braided, only stronger, as if the valley had opened a window on a room I hadn't been allowed to enter. Cam ZA blinked. Cam C wore a film of wet needles I brushed away. Across the creek, the cedar skirt and the not quite rectangle were darker than they had been yesterday, more private. I crossed at the shale wall, testing edges with the tip of the staff, watching for the slickness that pretends to be soundstone. The creek was up a fraction, not enough to turn me back, just enough to make its voice even. At the toe of the slope, I planted the first stake and called it Station 0 because numbers comfort me. 10 meters up, 17 dir, 20, 23 dir, 30, 26 dir. At 40, the angle dropped, again, to a measured 20 degree while my boots argued for 24. I logged the map sense and the bone sense on separate lines because they belong to different parts of the head. 50, 25 dig, 60, 24 dig, 70 returned to 26 dig and stayed loyal to itself as the wind leaned and then relented. At each station, I clapped toward the shale wall and got the honest 1.3 seconds, wind ruffled or not. Toward the notch, the return went late, early, same rude rhythm, then straightened for 3 claps in a row before slipping out of time again like a tired musician. I wrote the pattern as check marks and small circles so the page wouldn't look as nervous as I felt. The quiet patch declared itself at 35 through 55 meters, a low pressure of slope where the clinometer read softer than my tendons. I paced the contour, and the ground gave under the powder with a curiously elastic chill, the same fine grid skulking under a hand's worth of snow, squares now softened by thaw, and yet counting like they had a shift to finish. I laid the tape across center points, 40 centimeters center to center, again and again, until I could not call it coincidence without embarrassing myself in front of the trees. At 60 meters, I set the staff, sighted back down with the pocket transit, and drew a triangle to the bench that would look beautiful to a person who wasn't standing in thaw. The triangle closed within the transit's tolerance. Good, she would have liked that. Then I pivoted uphill to the cedar with the rectangle, took a bearing, and felt the old 2-degree argument tug at my thigh where the brass compass rode. I left it in the pocket and dialed the base plate against the bezel like a stubborn student. So 26 deer. When I finally let the brass lid click open, the needle spun, found north, then in a clean, unapologetic motion, walked to 028 DE and rested there without a tremble. I closed it as if I'd let something impolite into the conversation. By late morning, sleet had changed to flakes with the size and softness of surrender. The bench blurred at the edges. I set a cam in a low cavity of roots at station 40, lens angle shallow, just to watch the quiet patch with the expressionless attention a camera can keep when a person cannot. I tied it off with cord until the knot told my wrist bones it would hold. I left a laminated note under a flat stone near the stake with the day's date and the time I would pull hardware if the storm built a wall in front of the pass. Method before romance. The rectangle at 6/10 lived darker now, but the face, the shy table of bark, still pressed its half digits forward when the wind held its breath. The dot between zeros lived, and the final curve insisted on 6 as if it had rehearsed. I did not touch. I sidelit and wrote, face legible at stills, sleet reduces. Below, at shin height, the underline I'd refused to promote had grown confident in the wet, 3 dashes, gap, dash, bow. That language belonged to men who worked before plastic, who painted on bark because bark was there. If there was meaning, it would be in a ledger that no one had asked me to fetch. The storm window opened wider than forecast, then threatened to slam. On the hour, I hustled down to the creek to read my ribbon again. Mid-channel, 3.2 dig, then 3.0 dig at the riffle when a gust pushed a chill skin across. North edge ribbon, 5.7 dig, 5.9 dig, and once, when a lull fell so fast I heard my own breath, 6.1 dig before the number crept back. The seep under the moss kept faith at 7.4 dig, as if it had been told a different story about weather. When I set the probe on the dark seam itself, the hairline that read like a bruise running under the duff, the readout jumped to 7.7 dig the instant the tip kissed it, then settled back to 7.5 dig, a tender eddy of warmth under weather that wanted everything on one note. At the same minute, Cam B, my notch watcher, blinked an odd cadence I've learned to mark. I jogged to the bench, slid the card into the viewer with fingers that did not need instruction, and thumbed to the last hour. The camera had swallowed sleet and kept its poise. A series of frames showed fur shadows, a jay's flicker, then, at 11:02:17, the rectangle's face brightened by a narrow measure, and the grid under the cedar skirt appeared as points of ordered brightness, 4x5, then 5x6, as if a chessboard had taken a breath. One frame later, black with time stamp. 11:02:22 flicked alive. The 5-second skip walked in like it paid rent. The grid was gone. I caught my breath the way a person does when they've been too careful, and something obliges them anyway. I didn't write proof. I drew a small box at 11:02 with an arrow to the creek ribbon number because for reasons I cannot defend, the two felt coupled in my hand. The wind changed vectors with the bored cruelty topography loves. Down canyon became up canyon as the snow grew large and soft. Sound flattened. The usual cues lost their edges. I was at station 50 when the delayed echo trick gave me its clearest mischief of the week. A clap toward the notch, with the return arriving not late this time, but split. A thin echo first, almost anxious, then the honest body of the tone. A double that should have belonged to two surfaces and felt like one with a mood. I marked it with a star, and under it wrote, thin plus body, then felt silly, and drew a hyphen so my notes would stop trying to be poetry. I set the last staff at station 80, and counted back down by tens to keep from rushing when the flakes thickened. The quiet patch held its odd angle to the end of the transect like a well-practiced lie. At the cedar, I checked the camera one last time and left it, because the slope said leave it, because the rectangle did not want me any closer, because the day had set the fee for answers too high for a person alone. The moral pressure sharpened at the crossing. The creek had lifted to the top of the shallow stones. The shale wall hummed under the water like a taut valve. I waited for the wind to smooth, and then took the 2 honest steps the wall would accept. My shin dipped, and the cold set its teeth quickly enough to make me exhale through my nose. I gained the bench and stood with my hand on the cribstones, letting the green sweet smell of the north face wash my mouth clean. Above me, a limb cracked with a report that would have been thunder if I'd wanted drama. It was only wood in weather doing what wood does. A jay scolded the breaking as though it had been intended as theater. Harvest or hold. The storm window swung on its hinge. I made the smallest big choice I could. Pull cam A and cam C, leave the cedar camera and the station 40 root cavity watcher to keep tally on the quiet patch until morning. If the pass closed, they'd cold camp and talk to no one. If I got back in, I'd read them before the next weather wrote a page over ours. Back at the bridge, the plaque and I reenacted our ritual. Baseplate arrow, north. Brass needle, 2 degrees east with the poise of something that has decided not to be sorry. The altimeter watch chose that moment to climb 3 meters while the deck did not. The trace on the watch's graph made a clean stair step. I laughed once under my breath because if I didn't, I would start arranging words into explanations the day had not asked me to write. In the attic, I shook melt from the dry bag, set it down, and watched the familiar damp oval bloom. A second oval slid east of it, farther than yesterday, a finger's width now, and stopped. I knelt and drew a little bar between the pencil marks I'd made on the floorboard last night. The bar made me feel childish and properly grounded at once. On the table, I laid today's station numbers along the fold, then traced the quiet patch under the vellum where the hush lay in the lidar, an oval with a thumbprint notch. When I folded the butcher paper along the bench line and set it nose to nose with her fold, the hush lay half on the hidden face, half on mine, a thing reluctant to choose. I pulled the cards from Cam A and Cam C and let the laptop breathe them in while I warmed my hands on the mug. Ordinary night, ordinary day, the understory bowing and unlatching, the fern tips rehearsing their choreography, the seam's dark line drawing itself thoughtful as a vein. Cam C gave me one last small defiance. At 11:02, an image of the understory showed a faint brightness crosswise to the fern lean, low, and rectangular, as if someone had held up a framed pane and then thought better. The next frame, black with timestamp, 11:02:05. The skip came on time. The brightness did not return. I wrote the time next to the creek ribbons high and underlined them together, even though the habit makes me cross with myself. I ended the day the way a person ends a page they don't want to leave. Brass compass closed on the vellum above mile .0 old. Hinge aligned to the fold. Altimeter watch face down so its tick counted without recruiting my eyes. Pencil laid across the butcher paper like a splint. Wind climbed the rafters and then let go. The house leaned a gentle fractional degree, the way it always has. The two damp ovals on the floor cooled to dull. I opened the brass lid once more, just enough to let the needle see the room, and it found north. And then, like a polite animal returning to its mark, stepped east by 2 degrees and stayed there while the storm pushed its shoulder against the roof. Tomorrow, I will bring the ledger to 6/10 and nothing else. A window like this closes for months if you get greedy. The bench will be there. The hush will keep its shape. The creek will hold its temperature like a secret. I folded the butcher paper along my own crease and felt the fold stiffen, as if paper could remember exactly how it liked to be asked. The storm left its handwriting on everything. Every twig wore a white underlining, and the bench, when I stepped onto it, carried a hush like a library after the pages turned. I had one job I would let myself do: bring the ledger to 6/10 and then go home with my hands still listening. I repeated it until it felt like a rule instead of a hunger. The altimeter watch matched the deck after a single sigh. The plaque pretended to be honest in bronze. The brass compass warmed my palm and then lived in the pocket, lid closed, because I wanted today to be about the parts of a map that stand up in daylight. Up valley, the air tasted green sweet again with that small coin tang braided through it. At the lay-by, I brushed wet needles from Cam A and Cam C and left them with their simple assignment: keep the everyday true. The creek had swollen a tone lower, not bank full, just deliberate. The north edge ribbon of warmth held around 5.5 degrees once the probe stopped the telling me about my own impatience. The seam, dark hairline under the duff, sat where it had sat yesterday and the day before, a bruise the valley could not hide from someone staring at it too long. I crossed at the shale wall. The stones were honest and slick. The staff told my feet what the water couldn't. Up the slope, the first traverse carried a fine dusting of new snow that had settled even, uncommitted. At the 40-meter station, the patch that had measured soft against the body, I set a fresh flag of dull tape and read the angle again. 20 degrees when the boot said 24. The grid under the powder admitted itself twice when I brushed it with the back of the glove. Squares softened by thaw, but counting like clockwork. 40 centimeters, center to center. Contractor's spacing. I wrote it. I did not write what I wanted that to mean. At the cedar skirt, 6/10, I did not touch the bark. I never have. I side-lit it with the shielded flashlight and let the face, patient as old arithmetic, rise by degrees. 0.0, curve that insisted on being 6. The underline below, in the damp of the storm's leaving, had shed thrift and shown itself. 3 dashes, gap, dash, with a stub of paint like a fingernail at the right edge. I leaned away again, so my breath would stop making the number look like a trick. I set the little transit on its short legs in the snow and took the triangle I had promised myself. Bench to stake to face. The angles closed today without argument. Even the base plate and the transit behaved like colleagues. The wind had gone out to fetch something and left the notch breathing on its own. When I clapped toward the shale, the return came at the clean 1.3 seconds. Toward the notch, the echo split again. Thin, then body. Two sounds that belonged to one shape. I drew the split on the butcher paper that I'd folded along the bench line and pressed against my thigh. A vertical slash, then a full bar. I knelt at shin height in the cedar skirt and reached under where I had tucked the camera 2 days ago. The card slid free with grit under the pad of my thumb. Back on the bench, I sat with my knees against the crib stones and the viewer in my lap. The creek's voice making a dark thread I could follow if I needed to leave all this and sleep. Cam A gave me its parade of ordinaries. Juncos like soot, moths like snow remembered. Cam C showed the understory bowing and unbowing, the seams thought made visible in the tilt of fern tips. Then Cam B, the watcher at 6/10. The first clips were what they had been every evening. Dark, careful, true. At Oro 6:11, the storm still stitching, an early rectangle eased forward from bark to face, lighter by a breath. At Zoro 6:12, the underline sharpened until the 3 dashes and the lone dash felt less like decoration and more like a mark laid by a glove. At Zoro 6:13, the camera blanked to its black thick with marching numbers. 5 seconds later, the face returned. Then the frame after, Zoro 6:13:10, carried the sort of thing you don't get to plan for and can't claim. At the base of the trunk, inside the shadow of the cedar skirt, a slice of soil the size of a shoebox lit in a grid, bright on the points where the squares should meet, 6 by 4.5 visible before the skirt cut it. It was not reflection. There was no light to make reflection. It was not bloom. The camera had not been fooled into overexposure. It was as if the ground had chosen to remember in brightness for a single beat. The next frame went black again with the timestamp keeping count, as if the camera were steadying me. The grid did not return. It would be clean to say I understood something then. I did not. I understood only that the facts had chosen their company. A painted 10th mile face at shin height, where a crew once counted, a pallet-sized lattice somewhere below this slope at 40-centimeter centers, a seam feeding a warm ribbon downstream, a small magnetic stubbornness 2 degrees east of Polite, a LiDAR hush shaped like an oval with a thumbprint notch, echoes that split into thin and body and chose when to behave. 5-second absences where the cameras refused to report what the world was doing or the world refused to be reported. I called Walt from the bench because his name sat in my mother's margins, and I wanted a human sound inside the weather. He picked up on the 4th ring under the noise of a shop vac. I told him what I'd measured, not what I wanted it to be. Spacing, face, underline, warmth, the little stair steps on the altimeter graph, the way the echo came early when it shouldn't. He listened hard enough that I could hear him stop moving. They cribbed thresholds on some timber lines in those years, he said. Welded mesh laid on leveling sand to start cuts and drainage where the benches slumped. Sometimes they tied a seasoned seep into it so the pad stayed workable. If they doped the mesh with manganese paint, your nose would hear it first. If they dropped it and never lifted it, your compass would complain. If they walked it out to tenths, you'll find .7 ghosted up there too, if the hill hasn't eaten it. He let the words sit before adding what I already knew. Doesn't answer your clever camera trick. It didn't. A threshold grid buried shallow could account for the fine squares and the warmth and the smell, and even the slight magnetic sulk if minerals got involved. The hush in the contours made the kind of sense that arrives when a site was built for stability and then left to be beautiful. It did not account for time that skipped 5 seconds when the rectangle brightened, or for echoes that split like a thought in 2 rooms. I wanted to go look for 0.7 with the old discipline in my legs. I closed the notebook and let the discipline win in another way. Return alone had never meant hurry. I harvested the Station 40 cam and slid its card into the viewer there at the cribstones while the creek kept my hands correctly cold. It had watched the quiet patch with the patience I had asked of it. In among the sleet veils and the deer shadows, it caught one brief thing I can't place anywhere except on a line I'm not entitled to extend. At 11:02, the same minute the notch camera lit the grid, the root cavity cam recorded a low rectangle of brightness sliding across the quiet patch, crosswise to slope, as if someone had momentarily held a pane just above the ground and let it reflect a window that wasn't there. It lasted the span of a blink. The frame after went black with the 5-second skip, then ordinary again. I wrote the time, underlined it once, and let the pencil rest. From the cedar I took nothing. I left the camera. I left the face to be bark again. I carried the staff and the transit and the tape as if they weighed much more than they did. Let them lean against the truck with the deference of tools that had behaved. The plaque on the bridge accepted the baseplate arrow one last time without arguing. The brass compass, when I laid it beside, found north, then walked its small step east and stayed. The needles poised unembarrassed by the day. I pressed the lid closed and let it take my hand heat so it would stop shivering along with me. In the attic, the dry bag set its damp oval and then, obliging as habit, set the second oval to the east, another finger's width, the pair now almost a dotted line across the floorboard. I marked the new edges with the carpenter's pencil and wrote only the date. On the table I laid the vellum, folded along the bench line, and placed the butcher paper fold to fold. The hush on the lidar, oval with the thumbprint notch, sat half in the hidden face and half on mine, like a secret that had decided to be shared precisely to the point I could be trusted. I wrote my mother's word in the space above mile 0.6 in my own hand, not as an order, but as a receipt, return. Then below it, I wrote what I could say out loud without lying. Old threshold crib under slope at 40 centimeter centers, seep tied into mesh, magnetic mischief likely from doped metal or mineral seam, tenths once painted for crews, cameras report 5-second dark at moments of bright. Unexplained, echo splits thin body at notch, unexplained. Fold, aligns, bench to hush. It read like a ledger anyone could audit and find themselves nodded at. I closed the brass compass and set it on the vellum with the hinge aligned to the fold. The watch ticked in the quiet. Its little graph would make those funny stares again whether I stared or not. The house breathed in the way old houses let you know that they're still earning their corners. Outside, melt drifted from the firs in polite taps. I turned off the lamp and stood until the attic turned from room to outline. The two damp ovals on the floor held their east, small moons whose phases belonged to equipment and maybe something else. I put my palm flat on the map's fold and let the paper's memory push back, a slight stiffness at the crease, a willingness to open only to the point of kindness. There are trails you get to put back on paper, and trails you only get to stand beside with a pencil in your hand. This was the latter. I can live with that.